Today is an exciting lecture or talk or discussion, I should say, I think. Tony likes the discussion part, I think. And we're thrilled to have you with us today, Tony. We can't say enough, thank you enough for the partnership we've developed with Bertelsmann and the center. It's just been wonderful what our students and all of us have been learning. We got to show one of the 3 pieces of Sam's movie on Monday, which was just great. Of course, your film showed again yesterday, and what you're doing is so important for the discussion, and especially so close to the election. And what Tony and I were talking about his fabulous, beautiful book. I know some of you got a copy of it when we were distributing our swag, but if you don't have one yet, please find a time to come by the office, or we'll find a time to meet you and get your hands on it. Tony was generous enough to send us several copies. So thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to Bo and Grace to do the intros, and then we'll just let Tony take it away, and I look forward to discussion. Thanks, everybody.
Bo, Grace, Katie, thank you all very much for that really kind introduction. It's more fun than the introductions we usually get, so I appreciate that. And I'm really delighted to be here with all of you. I never pass up an opportunity to talk to students, and our engagement with UNC has been really special among all of our engagements. So thank you, Katie, for putting this all together and for keeping this going. So I'm also glad that you mentioned at the outset where you all are in the semester and that you're under particular pressure at the moment. I'll try to make this as painless as possible. And I know that sometimes PowerPoints can be absolutely excruciating. I will do my best to keep us away from the excruciating bit of this, and hopefully you'll find it interesting and different. But most importantly, I just want to get us through this so that we can have an opportunity to have an exchange with all of you. So with that, I'll go ahead and kick off here. Katie, do I have control of the screen? Looks like I do. And let's see. How does that look, Katie? Yeah, all right. I'll go ahead and get started. So to start off, I should probably begin by telling you what Disrupting Democracy is and where it all began. This program began in about 2015 when we were in the midst of the 2016 presidential election campaign. And we were trying to figure out what are the interesting trends that we're starting to see. It was a foregone conclusion, we thought, at that time that Hillary Clinton was going to be president. But we started to take a closer look at what was going on in that election campaign, because it was different than any election campaign we had seen before. And one of the things that we really paid attention to was the impact of technology on the election campaign. For better or for worse, it had a really significant impact. And it got us thinking about how do we create a project that looks at these trends, not just what's happening in the United States, but see if we can spot trends that are happening all over the world. And we thought to be as forward-looking as possible to really try to get ahead of what's on the cutting edge. And that's what we aim to do with Disrupting Democracy, is really look at what's happening in politics, what's happening in democracy through the lens of technological innovation. And as you'll see as we go through some of this, we look at this through using a number of different tools. So we started in the first year with Disrupting Democracy Volume 1, which was a really standard publication that you would find coming out of most think tanks, although the topic was a bit different and a bit unique. And what we tried to do is look at how technology was impacting societies, politics, the relationship between people. And we used 5 cases in that first volume. And we tried to choose cases where countries were at a different point along the technological spectrum. So we used countries as diverse as India and the United States. And then we also looked at where countries stand on the democracy spectrum. So we looked at countries like Israel on the one hand and Cuba on the other. So which, as you can imagine, was not very well placed on the democracy spectrum, but we wanted to have some contrast and some interesting case studies. And so we drafted the first volume looking at that. Then we moved on to Volume 2, and we wanted to really put technology to the test in the crucible of some really difficult challenges. And so we used the second volume to look at how technology was impacting active election campaigns. And so for that book, we focused on 4 elections. We focused on the 2018 midterm election in the US. We focused on the election, the parliamentary election in Latvia. We focused on Mexico. which they were having a presidential election that year. And the fourth case was Italy. I knew it would come to me eventually. We looked at the Italian case, and if you know anything about Italian history, they change governments as often as most of us change our shoes. So it was really interesting to go through that, but looking at it through a different perspective. And so if you're interested in any of those cases, I urge you to take a look at Volume 1 and Volume 2. And I thought it was really informative in terms of what sort of trends cut across all of these countries, and they weren't relegated to a particular region or a particular set of countries. These are global challenges that we're facing, all to varying degrees, but we see these patterns repeat over and over again. So it was something I thought that was really fascinating. And that brings us to this year, and that's where we'll kick off this PowerPoint. Disrupting Democracy Volume 3 was something that we wanted to do a little bit different. A couple of years ago, we had a change in our executive director at the Bertelsmann Foundation, and she came from the creative sector. And for years, we were doing our work as a transatlantic think tank in a very conventional way. We did research, we produced long form papers, short form papers, policy briefs, white papers, and so forth. So it's a pretty traditional approach to transatlantic issues. And when our executive director came in, she looked around and saw not just what was happening here in our office, but the landscape around DC and elsewhere, and tried to figure out how best we could compete and distinguish ourselves as a really unique operation amongst a really crowded field. And where she came to, and it suited her own background, is that we would try to deliver the products that other think tanks are delivering in a very different way. And we were going to think about what the consumers are most likely to consume. We couldn't pretend any longer that everybody was reading long-form publications when they weren't. We couldn't pretend that they were absorbing all of this content when the metrics told us something completely different. So we had to go where the consumers were going. And so we started with focusing a lot on infographics, focusing on short digital animations, focusing on short and long documentary films. And it turned out that that was a really effective approach to really connecting with the public, which is in our remit. We're nonpartisan, we're meant to educate and try to get the message out about what's happening in this world to as many people as we possibly can in a way that they actually want to consume. And that led us to where we are and how we do our work today. And we can talk about that a bit more later. But it brings us directly to this book, Disrupting Democracy Volume 3. So the goal here was, after writing 2 books, to not write anymore. Not only was I tired of writing so much for 2 years, but the truth is that people weren't consuming it the way we had hoped they were consuming it. And so we had to change our approach. And what we decided to do with this book is, instead of looking at how technology was impacting a series of countries, we wanted to use technology to help us explain what's happening in certain countries around the globe. And so we worked with a partner who was a data miner in India. And they had done work over the years looking at different political elections in India and abroad, where they were able to use algorithms that they designed to collect as much data as possible to try to understand what's happening in each of these elections. And they do it at a very granular level. So every election you see, there are these big picture narratives that come across, and everybody, most of the time, just accepts it. Okay, that's what happened. What we tried to do with our partners, and what we tried to do in this publication, is really drill down and give some unconventional explanations or greater detail about the conventional explanations to what happened in these different contexts. And so what we did with this book is we decided we're going to use as few words as we possibly can, and we're going to tell the story through pictures. And so that's what we've tried to do here. And so let's go ahead and get into this. So what we've done with this book is we focused on 4 case studies. The first case was in the UK. We focused on Brexit. The second was in the US, and it was a combination of the 2016 and 2018 election. Then we went to India and focused on the re-election of Prime Minister Modi. And then finally, we wrapped up with the presidential election in Brazil, which was the election of Jair Bolsonaro. And so we'll go through some of this, but just to give you a very high level overview of what we did, we've got these 4 case studies. We rounded up more than 10,000 data points and ended up with a book of about 80 graphics that will tell, the idea is to connect you piece by piece. And by the time you get to the end of each chapter, you have a deeper understanding of how we ended up in the point where we ended up. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started on the case studies. So the first one is Brexit. This is going back now to 2016. And what we tried to do is not just tell you what happened in the run-up to Brexit, but give you a longer view, because it didn't all start in 2015. The path to Brexit was a long and windy path. And in fact, in 1975, they didn't call it a Brexit referendum, but they had a referendum on British membership in the European Union. And it had a very different result. And so you see here in this infographic, here today, gone tomorrow, 1975, 68% of Brits wanted to remain as part of the European Union. It was still in its early stages, but there was a lot of enthusiasm for it. And it was a very different debate and a very different result. And so you see the result broken down by county. And it looked like just some of the islands up north who wanted to leave. And I couldn't tell you at this moment in time why, but they are who they are. And then we fast forward to 2016 and we see a very different picture. You go to the north where you see Scotland largely remain, Northern Ireland largely remain. And then you see in the southern part of the country, with the exception of London and its environs, you have a majority to leave. And so if you look at it as a snapshot like this, it tells you a very simple picture that England took, I'm talking about England, not the United Kingdom, England as a region took the entire UK out of the European Union. And it's very different than what occurred 45 years earlier, 40 years earlier. So we try to focus, and again, I'm just going to give you a sample of some of these things. And if you're interested in looking at all the graphics, and I encourage you to do it, it's available online, and there are some books with Katie. So if you'd like that for your coffee table, by all means. I just want to give you a couple of interesting ones, and also a variety of the types of graphics that we use. One thing that I wanted to mention that I forgot to in the outset is that we deliberately tried to stay away from conventional line graphs and bar graphs. We thought it was really important to engage in a different way and try to make each infographic a piece of art, if we could. Now, you should probably know, at full disclosure, I'm only capable of drawing stick figures. So the art here is not mine, but we work with a really capable artist who was able to bring these ideas to life. So that's what you're seeing here. So on this graphic, An Empire Lost, this one is about nationalism, about British greatness and what it was and what it is today. And if you talk to Brits, they'll tell you that things have changed quite a bit. They used to be a global player. Those who are realistic about their place in the world now, they'll tell you that they're a second-tier player at this stage and complementary to the United States in many cases, where they see this special relationship. And so I just wanted to have a graphic here that showed what they were and what they are now. And that's what this graphic shows. The little pink bit is the United Kingdom. And then you see the rest of the world as it is. So this next infographic I think is interesting because, and we'll get into it a little bit later about cross-cutting trends, but this is all about inequality. And if you go back, this goes back just to 1997, but what you see here is a pretty significant trend in increasing inequality in the UK over time. And what we've seen in the UK and what we see in just about every country imaginable where inequality is on the rise, we see political instability. And it was no different in the UK. And there are people that pointed to this inequality as the reason for their Brexit vote. They blame the European Union in large part for their lot in life. And their vote reflected that. So that's why I wanted to highlight this particular graphic. Yeah, show up or shut up. I love this one. I'm surprised that our editors let me get away with this title, but I'm delighted that they did. And truly, this graphic could be shown in the United States as well. This is all about voter turnout and voter apathy, and they're one and the same when it comes to the UK, and it's been one and the same when it comes to the United States. I'm delighted to see some of the early voting numbers coming out in the US. There seems to be a lot of excitement around this particular election. In the UK, there was a downward trend in voter participation. You see the average line cutting across there in red. They've been below average now going on 20 years, 25 years. So it's been some time. And, we have the statistics here, and then we did interviews where we have qualitative information from voters who tell you why. And the reason is they don't care about the system anymore. It hasn't served them, and they don't trust any politicians. I don't know if that's familiar sounding to any of you. I imagine it might be. But again, this is a trend that is global. And the UK, this is how it bears out in the numbers. So that's the UK. And we can go back in as we get into the discussion. If you want me to go back and talk about any of these topics, I'm very happy to do so. But again, I just want to give you a little sample. So that brings us to the next chapter. That's India, the rise of cultural nationalism. The original title of this was The Rise of Religious Nationalism. And I mention that to you because depending on who you talk to in India and what their cultural or religious background is, they would find that to be a very sensitive label or an exact label. And we have Indian partners, and this is the one that they felt was most balanced. But the truth is that this chapter is about religious nationalism and division, and how Prime Minister Modi uses the divisions in the country to hold on to power and to expand his power, is what he did in his re-election campaign in the parliamentary races in 2019. So I should mention that obviously they have a parliamentary system, so you vote for the party and not the individual, but Modi is the face of India. Modi is the face of the BJP, his party, and now the largest party by a pretty significant majority. And he uses these divisions to stoke chaos, to stoke division, and it suits the BJP to do so. And you'll see how the numbers work. So the first thing that I wanted to mention is pillar of democracy. I put it as a question mark because, like the United States, both India and the United States tout themselves as strong democracies. I think now in 2020, we can put a question mark after both. In India, there's been a significant crackdown in media freedom, in operations of NGOs, and it comes down to the choices that Prime Minister Modi has made to curtail freedom of speech, to curtail criticism of his administration. And so I put a question mark there, and I think it's up for debate whether India is a functioning democracy anymore or something else. What's important here in this graphic is the number. 1.35 billion people in India. When they go to vote, it is always the largest election in the world, every time they go to vote. It is complicated, it is messy, but they do a pretty incredible job of running an election. And I encourage you to take a look at how that works at some point. It's fascinating. But when you look at 1.3 billion, what's interesting about this is when in the subsequent slides, when we talk about percentages, a small percentage in India is a big number. So I just want you to keep that in mind as we go through that, because if we're talking about 10%, we're still talking about 135 million people. That's half the size of the United States, more than half the size. So these are big, big numbers we're talking about, and unmanageable in a lot of ways. So this gets into the issue that I just mentioned about the religious mix. And it is a very divided society, primarily Hindu. You've got the second largest religious group is Muslim. And then you have a variety of religions on down the line. The largest divisions have always been between Hindu and Muslim, and that goes back to the partition in the 1940s. So there's a long history of how this all works, and a long history of Indian politicians using the divisions between Hindu and Muslim to political ends. And it's no different now. And some would say that it is finally time that Hindu nationalism comes out of the shadows, and that it is front and center of everything that the BJP does, both in terms of policy and in terms of electoral politics. This isn't a partisan or a sectarian view from my point. This is just a fact of how things are operating at the moment. So that's, I think, a really pretty infographic. It's also worth mentioning. Here's another one that looks at how you can slice Indian society again by caste. For those unfamiliar with India, this is how society breaks down and has been broken down for generations. What's interesting about this is that the BJP has done a really good job of appealing across all castes. And a lot of it has to do, and you look at the numbers here, the caste system only exists in the Hindu religion. It doesn't exist in the Muslim society, and doesn't exist in the Sikh society. And so, in fact, there's been a fairly interesting trend among lower caste Indians to convert to Sikhism or Christianity because it takes them outside of the caste system. So they find more opportunities outside of the Hindu caste system, which I thought was a really interesting thing that I hadn't really considered beforehand. But this gives you a little flavor of how much influence the BJP has had, excuse me, across all the castes. So the last one I wanted to show you, I thought it was very unique. Aside from the symbolism of the sacred cow, which I love, this is about the connection between the economy and economic performance, the Indian GDP, and voting patterns. And what's really unique, and I didn't find this in any other case study going back to book one, this is the only country that I've seen that seems to be impervious to economic movement when it comes to their vote. Whether the economy is up, the economy is going down, we found almost no relationship at all between the choices people made at the ballot box and the economic situation in the country. I thought that was really interesting and something different. So I wanted to flag that for you all in this discussion. And I suppose we can speculate as to why that is, but maybe we'll save that for later. Okay, so that takes us to the US, the descent into demagoguery. Yeah, it's a pretty strong title, I think, for this one. There's no mincing words, I suppose, in terms of where we are, but we tried to look at the numbers. There's no question that this is happening. I was more interested in why, and so we got into some of the figures. And here, these numbers, most of you, I think, are Americans on this, will at least be familiar with how US politics works and how our electoral system works. So I won't go too deeply into this, but we thought showing the Electoral College and was important because it tells you a lot about why certain people get voted or get elected at any given point in time, and why the popular vote doesn't always reflect the ultimate result or the will of the people. And I just thought it was interesting to point that out at this stage. And we might be facing that again in just a couple of days. So another issue, we depicted this a different way, but it's the same idea as one that you saw in the UK. And that's all about income inequality, who's benefited over the course of the last 30 years. The top 1% have done really well. This is not going to be news to most of you, but this is an interesting depiction of how this actually worked in real time over the years. And so we've seen huge increases for the top 1%. The middle class has done well, but less well by quite a substantial factor. We didn't even get to in this graph who has done particularly well. Working class voters, they're off the chart here. So they didn't even make it off of the launch pad that we have here for the motorcycles, which tells you a lot about where we are as a country. Yeah, I had fun with this one. This is the Russian troll doll, or the Russian nesting dolls. And this is all about Russian influence in the 2016 and 2018 election. It's about disinformation. It's about what do consumers see? What are the voters seeing, and how are they being influenced? This led into a whole other path of how Russian disinformation provided by the GRU, the FSB, or the Internet Research Agency makes its way into the political bloodstream pretty quickly through normal channels. And they often come into the US through platforms like Breitbart, Daily Caller, Gateway Pundit, things like that, before getting reported on Twitter, then picked up by Fox News, and then picked up by the other outlets who are expected to keep pace. So it's been a really interesting story to follow. This is a story about 2016 that clearly continues today. We haven't seen a decline in this kind of influence over the years. What the ultimate objective is, I think, is up for debate. Some people suggest that it is to get Donald Trump elected. I would suggest that it's to cause chaos more than anything, to get Americans to be riled up about something, to cause divisions, to not trust institutions. I think that's the purpose of disinformation, as opposed to getting one person in particular elected. If that ultimately is the result, so be it. But I think the bigger societal issues about how we consume information is really highlighted in this kind of graphic. And then the last thing is it goes back to really the core of the project, and that's about how technology is influencing our lives, how we engage in social media. I'll be curious maybe when we get to the discussion. I can't see all of you now, but I wonder how many of you get their news almost exclusively now from social media. And maybe that's something we can talk about in the discussion to follow. But it's clear that the trends are moving in the direction of a lot of time spent on social media platforms, digesting and consuming most of your material now via the various platforms. So that's what this one is about here. And then the last one I'll go through is the case of Brazil. And this one is particularly close to my heart because I spent some time working in Brazil and I spent a lot of time with the politics and the politicians in Brazil. So I've got a fondness for it, and it breaks my heart to see what has become of Brazilian politics. This chapter is called The Case for Cleaning House. This is a reference to probably the most significant issue in Brazilian politics, and that is corruption. And that is the people's overall distrust for all political parties and politicians. And that really is what led to the rise of Bolsonaro as being the president of Brazil. So we can have a look at what this chapter entails. So this infographic looks at the long history of the rise and fall of various presidents going back to 1985. And the record, as you see here, is not a very strong one of presidential success. Many have been impeached, many have been removed or had to resign as a result of corruption scandals. A measure of success is to leave office at the end of your term with the economy in chaos. That seemed to be the measure of success for a Brazilian leader, which is not really high praise. But this gives you a little snapshot of what that looks like. This next one, I wanted to, in every chapter, I wanted to touch on the issue of inequality. Brazil is a unique case in that they actually took really active measures to close the inequality gap. I mean, if you look at the Gini coefficient, the number that measures inequality around the world, Brazil almost always ranks at the bottom, the most unequal countries in the world. Usually South Africa, Brazil tend to be in the mix. Going back to Lula, who was president of Brazil 3 cycles ago, he instituted a program called Bolsa Família, which was direct cash payments to poor Brazilian families. And that was the first time we saw a really significant spike, and you'll see that there's an upward trend starting in 2009 when Bolsa Família really took effect. And so you see that there are policy levers that can be pulled to change the trajectory of inequality in a country. Granted, in Brazil, they were starting from a really low baseline, but it did make progress. And the question is now, does raising people out of poverty make them prosperous or make them equal? And the answer overwhelmingly in Brazil is no. There are people that are better off, but certainly they're not at a point where the inequality gap has shrunk to a point where everyone is benefiting. And I think that part of the result of the Bolsonaro win was an echo of that inequality over time and the promises that weren't fully kept by subsequent Brazilian administrations. And this graphic here was important as well, because if you talk to anybody during Brazilian political campaigns, corruption usually is the #1 concern. Public safety is the second one. And crime, murder is a big problem in Brazil. And if you look here at I think this is the 19 or 20 most murderous cities in the world, half of them are Brazilian cities. And politicians of late in the last few election cycles have had to run almost exclusively on keeping people safe. And there have been a number of different tactics to try to achieve that. Some were gross violations of human rights, and we can go back to that in our discussion if you like. But this is a priority for every Brazilian administration. So this alongside corruption, how do we keep it clean and how do we keep people safe? If you can do that, you might have some electoral success in Brazil. And here's the last one that really connects us back to the title slide. For those of you who don't follow Brazilian politics, the car wash scandal you'll read about it, called the Lava Jato, was a multi-year investigation which really roped in hundreds and hundreds of Brazilian politicians and elite across the country it was basically everybody patting their pockets in a number of different ways. And when you hear about the car wash scandal, the average voter just shakes their head and just assumes at this point that everyone who's involved in politics are a bunch of thieves. And I can't tell you what that does to the political environment and public discourse when no one can be trusted. And that's really where we got to by the time the 2019 election came around in Brazil. So I want to try to put a bow on all this by looking at how some of the trends cut across all of these different cases. As you can see, each case has a vertical set of really distinct characteristics, but there are trends that cut across. And the first one I mentioned at quite a bit of length is inequality. And the question is whether inequality leads directly to populism. My guess is that it leads certainly to voter apathy and voter discontent. We're starting to see that maybe it's not populism, it's not the same type of populism in every country. There are countries that have looked to more technocratic governments to get them out of the economic situation that they find themselves in. But in these 4 cases, they all turn to populism, which I think is an interesting result. The second point I'll make is about disinformation. I alluded to it earlier. What does it do to trust in institutions? Well, the truth is that the goal of disinformation is to undermine trust in institutions, trust in democratic processes, trust in facts. It's not just in the United States where people are questioning facts or talking about alternative facts. I hear all the time what's happening on Earth 1 and what's happening on Earth 2. This is not the only place where that exists. And so disinformation is prevalent and the result is the same. It undermines people's faith in their own democracies. The third point is this idea about leaders learning from each other. And I don't mean that in a good way. If you look at just these 4 cases, there is a direct line between Donald Trump and Prime Minister Modi in how they operated in their own election campaigns. Donald Trump is very fond of viewing himself and touting himself as a trailblazer and really an innovator when it comes to using social media to electoral success. Prime Minister Modi in 2014 really was the pioneer behind using Twitter, using WhatsApp, using all the social media platform to connect to 1 billion plus Indians. He was using technology in 2014 to have, I guess, because I remember Tupac, I think, was the first one to do this, where they had holograms, where they used to beam Modi into different rural parts of the country, and he would give speeches via hologram. Trump learned from that. Trump learned from how to use social media to amplify your messages and how to get the mainstream press to report on every crazy thing that you tweet. That goes back to Modi. So they learned from each other. And I also think, by the way, it came back full circle that in 2019, Modi was able to learn from Trump. So there was a really close connection between those two. I also, if you point to Bolsonaro, he would be a technological protege of Donald Trump and actually describes himself as the Trump of the tropics. It's no accident that he models his behavior, his online persona after Donald Trump. They found success there, and I think that there's no question that there are lessons learned across each of these countries. The last point that I'll make, and I usually hate to end on a pessimistic note, but I mean, this is a realistic note, I'm afraid, and that is that we haven't seen the worst of it yet. I don't think we've turned the corner on the impact of technology, the negative impact of technology on our politics, on our society. There are good things that technology has done. Don't get me wrong, it's a mixed bag. But when we talk about politics, I would say that on balance, it has been a net negative to date. There is one case that I can point to right now, which I'm keeping an eye on because I'm optimistic about it, and is a case that has disappointed us for so many years, and that's Italy. And Italy, I think, had a little experience with their populist movements in the last election just 2 years ago, with the 5-Star movement and also Lega Nord, which is a right-wing extremist movement, and have decided after that little experiment, which was short-lived, that a more centrist technocratic government is a solution for what ails the country. And so I'm keeping an eye on Italy to see if that there's a contagion effect from there to other parts of Europe, to the United States, and beyond. So we haven't reached the bottom yet, but I'm hopeful that we might get there here in the next year or two. And obviously, what happens in our election in the US in just a couple of days, I think will resonate around the world, either way, depending on what the result is. So we'll all stand by for that. So I think I've gone way over time, and I promise not to torture you, and I'm not sure if I have, but you'll tell me in a second when we get into the conversation and we unmute your mic. So I will get out of this now and return it to you all. Thank you very much.